everyone, this is Ricki Spencer and welcome to another episode of Quest by Community, Our Health Matters. And today our special guest is Simon Katterl. Now that name may sound quite familiar to many of you, and for some that don't know, I would suggest you Google it. But we're going to learn more about Simon and his incredible work he has done in the area of human rights and mental health, and those who have been impacted by mental health. That is, those who have been forcibly hospitalised, those who have been in contact with hospitals, their families, their carers. And what does it mean if you are forcibly detained in a hospital setting? What does it mean for your rights? Can you have a say? When can you leave? And what happens to the information? Where does it go? And does it stay with you for the rest of your life? We're very privileged to have Simon. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Ricki. It's a privilege to be here.
So Simon, let's begin your journey first. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in far north Queensland, so up in Cairns and Irukandji country. And I sort of came down to study in Brisbane and studied law and politics, and I knew I wanted to be a kind of social justice person of some kind, but I didn't really know where I wanted to focus. Then I had my own breakdown. I was working overseas and I had my own breakdown. That's how I describe it. And it took me years really to just get to a point of safety and, you know, not be in that sort of constant sort of suicidal space that I found myself in. And really when I had that experience, I knew I wanted to work in mental health, and so I studied psychology because everyone who studies psychology wants to fix themselves usually. And so I didn't do that. But I came and I actually ended up finding this job, which was at the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council. And it was to be a consumer advocate. I'd never heard of the term consumer advocate before. And sort of like I somehow got the job. But it found me working in public mental health services, or made me working for consumers subject to compulsory treatment in public mental health services. I've been really fortunate to kind of avoid the tertiary or hospital end of the system. And I think that really shocked me. It shocked me what I saw. I felt very privileged that by luck and probably privilege, I didn't find my way into that end of the system. But I kind of just thought, oh, I think my skills or motivation needs to go in this direction. So that's kind of, I ended up working in the mental health space for 10 years now. And I enjoy it. It's hard yakka, but I don't know, you do work in the space too. So yeah, it's a privilege.
So let's now unpack a little bit for our audience. Mental illness. We hear this word a lot. We hear it everywhere bandied.
Yeah.
And within the community, we have a problem with it. Within First Nations spaces, they have a problem with that term. Why is it such a contested term?
I'll give you my thoughts on it, but they're certainly not the final words. I suppose one of the reasons the term can be so, a lot of people say, oh, mental illness is like any other illness. Maybe, but maybe not. You know, sort of the way that these diagnostic categories have been developed and who developed them it sort of begs questions. There's often not been people with lived experience involved in the design of, you know, the sort of categories of mental illness that we sort of talk about here and now. And so we know some old categories that we used to have were discriminatory and caused a great deal of harm. And, you know, some people say some of the current categories are the same. One of the other, I guess, criticisms of the mental health or contests around mental health diagnoses is that they sort of have been dominated and developed by the global north, you know, so the sort of Eurocentric model of mental health, so which can kind of marginalise different ways other cultures understand and respond to distress. So different formulations, different understandings of distress. Sometimes normal cultural expressions can be pathologized as a mental health issue when they're actually quite normal within certain cultures. I know, you know, I know that there's, you know, within First Nations communities, there's critiques of some of these models as well, but I'm certainly not the expert on that.
One thing that I'm interested to know, Simon, what was it like for your experience when you were unwell, based the fact that you had completed your law degree, so you understood what happens in terms of once somebody has that label. How did you come to terms with that, with your experience and your, I guess, how you would embrace that or somehow work with it, being a lawyer at that time?
Yeah, I remember, so because I had my breakdown probably a couple of years before I finished law school, and I remember I was maybe the first or second person within that law school to ever come out and talk about having their own breakdown. So it was kind of quite strange. Now it's pretty common that people talk about their lived experience, but it was kind of quite a scary thing to do back then. One thing I reflect on is that a lot of my diagnoses are around like trauma and depression. Increasingly, there's with my psychologist, we're talking a bit about OCD features that kind of come through in some of my behaviours. But I've been kind of, I guess, lucky that the diagnoses I've been given haven't attracted the kind of legal and human rights consequences that other diagnoses get. And I say that because sometimes people think, it's, if you haven't experienced some of the damaging parts of systems, you don't understand the kind of the stigma and discrimination that can come from things. And so you might say, there's no problems with any of these categories or the way they're used, or mental health is just like health. Well, maybe that's because you haven't been detained, or you haven't had compulsory treatment, or you haven't had your mental health diagnoses weaponized in the way that it can be for some people. And for me, that really, I noticed that a lot more when I compared my experience as a sort of someone who just graduated law and had my own experience of mental health issues that were really difficult. But my rights weren't dramatically infringed during that time. It was only when I went into the system and saw what was happening there that I saw all of the human rights issues and the legal problems that come up.
Let's now unpack compulsory treatment orders and why are they so problematic?
I can only speak to, I guess, the experiences of others around me when I talk about it from the perspective around harm. So some of the people who are watching or listening might be aware that in Victoria we have a Mental Health and Wellbeing Act. It used to be called a Mental Health Act, and every other state and territory around Australia has a similar act. Those acts authorise people to be detained within hospitals, given treatment without their consent, and treated compulsorily in the community as well on a community treatment order. Why is it damaging? There's multiple reasons for it. I suppose the first is it breaches people's human rights. There's a Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's an international covenant or convention that Australia signed up to and said we're going to commit to these principles, but kind of like a lot of international laws, the Australian government and the state and territory governments haven't quite lived up to that. And that really, there's different interpretations you can make of that. One interpretation is we should be really minimising compulsory treatment. Another, which is probably mine, is we should try to phase it out. And so we're breaching international human rights law by doing that. That's important, but I wouldn't say it's the most important reason to critique compulsory treatment. The most important reason is it comes from people with lived experience who say this caused me more harm than good. It embedded stigma and discrimination. I didn't have a say over my treatment. There were so many harms that arose from my compulsory treatment around, just the things that were said and done to me, and the physical trauma associated with that, but also the physical kind of physical side effects and ongoing harmful effects of some of the medications that have been given to people. I know you mentioned some of those issues as well, and I think you hear that a lot. Yeah.
And I think that takes us to the next important question, Simon, that prior to you coming on, I had so many people reach out to me. And that comes to information written about somebody when they are, I would say, incarcerated.
Yeah.
Those might call it hospitalised. Why is that such an issue, and why do we need to really understand that more?
Yeah, well, firstly, I just want to affirm that I think the term incarcerations captures people's experience, doesn't it? And not just experience, but the actual the act of what is being done. So we can often, particularly in health settings, minimize the harm or the injustice of an act by saying it's benevolent, and like, oh, people mean well, so it can't be called incarceration. I think you hit the nail on the head there. In terms of what's written about people and what are their rights, I just think the first thing I'd name is that one of the injustices in that whole process is that things are written about you without you, and that often when you have peer-led services, so services that are led by people with lived experience, one of the most common practices that's done by peer support workers and some other community mental health workers is co-written notes, where you write the notes together so that you're firstly as transparent about what's being written about you, but also that you're making meaning together in that process, which allows for a much more kind of therapeutic or meaningful or equal relationship across most parts of, I'd argue, if not virtually all of Victoria's public mental health system. Certainly in the hospital environment, that's not the common practice. There's ways that you can access that information. You can do like a FOI or a Freedom of Information, or access it through the Health Records Act. That's one way to access that information. But those processes are slow. These laws are pretty clunky and they do need to change. I think you spoke about the My Health Records as well. Sometimes a lot of information stored there that can be accessed by other stakeholders. I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that some LGBTIQ plus community groups and organisations have written about the need to handle this information sensitively as well. So yeah, I think I don't really understand how the state and Commonwealth information systems go together. Like, I actually genuinely don't know. So I wouldn't want to comment too much on that because I'm not an expert.
And I think that's the complexity that a lot of people are asking me, how our personal information is kept.
Yeah.
And because we're in a space where there's states that look after health, and then you've got the Commonwealth who looks after, the peak bodies, and trying to navigate that. And sometimes I feel as though policy makers are trying to rush through, this wonderful new thing. We can have everything on on an app accessible. But my thinking and a lot of other people's concerns are, but what type of information are we going to be able to access, and who else is going to access that? Primarily insurance, health insurance. Will it be disclosed? When somebody has a diagnosis, say borderline personality disorder or schizophrenia or bipolar, what does that mean for the person in terms of having that label from your experience?
There's parts of it that are outside of their control and parts of it inside of people's control. In terms of what it means for someone, in some ways that's for them to make meaning out of, does that diagnosis feel like it captures their experience? Often you can get, I think I've had 4 or 5 diagnoses. A lot of people can have, a list longer than their arm as well. And you sort of look and you go, well, how can I have all of these? Like some of these must be wrong. So I sort of give it as much weight as it, as it serves you. For me, I found diagnoses really helpful at an early stage of my recovery, where I was really just trying to understand why I was feeling the way I was feeling. But, as time went on, I sort of understood my experiences in different ways. And so I've kind of, my relationship to it has changed. But others, that's totally up for people about how they relate to it. What does it mean for people, sort of for things outside of their control? Well, I mean, there's a lot of community attitudes towards people with lived experience of and have been labelled or diagnosed with schizophrenia or BPD, and there's lots of instances of discrimination in law, in the media, just in daily attitudes and practices, and those things aren't. I mean, we're seeing that in the media at the moment with some of the Bondi Junction media reporting, and some of the sensationalist reporting that's going on there. those things are not within people's control.
Interesting. I had a few conversations with some lawyers, and also it was in relation to labelling.
Yeah.
And my kind of problem with diagnosis is that they're almost linear and fixed.
Yeah.
And when you give someone a fixed label, it means it sits with that person, and that identity, even though it was constructed, it's a construction. It's an artificial construction.
Yeah.
So it almost says that that person is always going to have those characteristics and therefore enact. And then what was interesting was some of the lawyers were saying, oh, anyone who I work with who discloses that they have bipolar or BPD, I don't trust them. And their information when it comes to providing information in a court setting can be used, and I would call it weaponized and discredited.
Yeah.
Is that something that is problematic, that once you have a label of being bipolar, or you come out and say you have bipolar or BPD, does that therefore mean that in some professional spaces you're kind of not seen as a reliable, safe person?
Just to be clear, I was laughing at the lawyers in question. Having gone through law school, you don't get taught emotional intelligence. It should be a subject though. People talk about that as sort of epistemic injustice in some ways. So the idea that you can't be valid, there's two forms of it. I think there's hermeneutic injustice and testimonial injustice. So testimonial injustice being your testimony about what's happened to you is not valid or reliable. And hermeneutic injustice is the more complex one I often forget. But basically you can't be a valid knowledge holder. You can't be an expert in mental health if you've got your own lived experience, when we know it's actually the opposite of that. So yeah, I think those issues come up a great deal. I think the tide is turning a little bit on that. As you were sort of saying that, and something else that was coming through my mind was some work by someone called Ian Hacking, and you are the sociological kind of expert here, but this feels sociological to me. It spoke about something called looping effect, where once you're given a diagnosis, it can sometimes, certainly with other people when they perceive you, but also yourself, you actually start to try to live up to the diagnosis. So you interpret every experience you have through that kind of diagnostic label. When the anger you're having, the anxiety you're having, the sadness you're having, maybe that particular instance is just a normal human experience in response to something annoying, someone said. Situational, perfect.
And we seem to be missing that. Yeah. That is the gold nugget.
Yeah.
That we're taking away situational responses to different environmental things that are happening.
Exactly.
But when we take on these fixed label states, and it's very powerful. And I always think, and I know with your work, that sort of, and I must say to the audience, I've followed Simon for many years because he's really made me think too about, well, who are like the invested power of the pen when a psychiatrist who is the person right at the top who can prescribe this diagnosis.
Exactly.
And then this has a legal ramifications.
Yeah.
And it's threaded through that person. And you almost be indoctrinated into that. And if you don't get indoctrinated and you reject or you try and rebel, you're then seen as non-compliant and you become more constrained and medicalized and chemicalized because you don't fit that label.
I think there's a term, one of those really complex terms, but anosognosia. But basically, they've come up with a medical term which means you don't have insight into the diagnosis that I've given you, which just means if you don't agree with it, then that's more evidence in some respects that you have the thing. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation sometimes, and it's. Insight is a term that would kind of seem quite banal to a lot of people who've not gone through the system, but that insight term can be quite loaded because it implies this kind of, if you're the psychiatrist, you're the expert, I'm the person who needs to take what you're saying, and any sort of departure from that relationship, it can be medicalised as a kind of problem that I'm having at the moment, and then you put the legal stuff on top of it to make me comply with the particular interpretation you have of me.
Now, Simon, we want to now move to a positive side.
Please.
Let's see, what can we do? How do we get involved? And I want to unpack if there are people who are listening who have had experiences of being either hospitalised and under a compulsive treatment order, or a carer, or a partner, or a family member or significant other. How can we get involved to make changes and have a say?
There are a number of opportunities to be part of committees. So the first thing to say is your lived experience matters. You know, if you're someone who's had lived experience of mental health issues and of having gone through the system, that really matters. And it's important, particularly people who've had who have experienced the sort of the challenges of the system and the benefits of the system. I think that's important too, to be sharing their experience and their evidence and testimony on what needs to improve and how it needs to improve. Now, there's ways to do that. You can join your peak bodies as a member. That's one way that you can do it. So if you have lived experience of mental health issues yourself, the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council, or VMIAC, is one peak body, and they advocate for the rights of people who have gone through the mental health system or going through the mental health system. Tandem, which is the peak body for families, carers and supporters and kin, are a really important peak body. Both of those organisations will be aware of consultation opportunities, committees to be on. Committees are a great opportunity to give input into mental health, existing mental health services, new mental health services, new mental health policies. And if you don't need any sort of degree in sociology or law or human rights. It's your expertise of having gone through the system that matters there.
And that's what I wanted our audience to know. You don't have to have a formal qualification, as though some people have asked me. It's about your living experience.
Exactly.
And what about the term, I just wanted to quickly say, I always say for myself, I'm a living entity. I'm not a lived entity when it comes to my experiences. Why is that important, do you think, for some people to acknowledge?
The language is always evolving. That's one thing. So even in the last 5 years, I don't think we were using the term, like in mental health, I don't reckon we were using the term living experience 5 years ago. So I think I'm a bit old and crusty where I haven't fully got my head around, but I think it's about us being an evolving kind of, you tell me actually.
Well, for me, and some of the stuff I've written about, for me, it's to say it's not stagnant.
Yeah.
And when something is lived, it presumes it's past and it's in a different way. But I'm still living my experience, my consciousness and my interaction with health services and the power. Yeah. And it really ties nicely with, for those who've studied Foucault and looking at, capillaries of power and who has, control over how we behave, and labels that. So for me, it's always this tension of who am I, who's observing me, and the line between you go. And I want to quickly, because I know we're running out of time, one thing we didn't get to, the training of police when it comes to those who are going through bouts of unwellness. Why is that such an issue still in 2025?
I mean, I think there's the training of police. I think there's just the question of whether police should be first responders anyway. You know, so just a couple of weeks ago, a person in crisis was shot dead, and that police are not meant to be. It shouldn't be the first responders for someone in crisis. We should have peer support workers as first responders. And non-coercive and carceral ways to respond. But training is a part of fixing that problem. I think another problem is just we need to restructure the system away from using police as a contact point, because it just sort of reinforces an old paradigm of fusing care and control, together.
Yeah. This is something that I feel so passionate about, being a social worker for 30 years, is that in child protection, and I used to hate that role. And police were always I could see sometimes the need at extremes, but I felt many times it was aggravates the situation.
Yeah.
And it would be better to invest in more peer living experience,
Yeah.
community focused ways to support people rather than just using that line of state apparatus coming in.
Yeah.
And that sight of a uniform
Yeah.
does something when you are unwell,
Yeah.
because it makes us associate with, I've done something wrong,
Yeah.
and you're going to take me away.
Yeah.
And we can't get away from that. And because of that, it's really complicated.
And it's partially true.
Yeah,
As in it's partially
yeah,
true in the sense,
yeah.
not in that someone's done something wrong, but you are treated like you've done something wrong by the state.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And that we need to really work on that. We need, as a community, to really go into reforming everything as to how we do things, and really re-examine power.
Yeah.
You know, and when you legislate and you're given the authority under an act to forcibly remove somebody, I really do feel we need to work on that. I was part of the WA's Restrictive Practices Act reform, and we looked at things such as restraint.
Yeah.
And we unfortunately don't have time to talk about restraining and the use of security guards, you know, in hospital settings, you know, and the impact and trauma that can have when somebody is going unwell. Because the last thing you need is someone forcibly grabbing you. Why, Simon, in 2025, are we not? Why does it take so long? I guess my final question around this, before we ask what you're going to be doing with the rest of your life, why in 2025 do we still use this type of method when it comes to when someone's unwell to look at that situation to resolve it?
I mean, I think it's morally wrong. It's abhorrent, and we know it causes a great deal of trauma. I think it's not an aberration of the system. It's a logical extension of the way the system is currently designed and what it's meant to do. You know, the current system is really there to, if you ask most people what do they think the purpose of the system is, they say it's to treat mentally ill people. That would be their definition of it. Whereas, you know, myself, I think probably yourself and others would see the purpose as supporting people to live a good life as defined by them. And you don't have a place for the whole system changes in response to that. The whole organisation of what kind of services we have changes in response to that shift. That's, I think, one of the most fundamental shifts we need to make, is that the system, if we call it that, needs to shift from a focus on treating mental illness to supporting someone's good life as defined by them. Treatment might be a component of it, but it's not the primary purpose. And so it's possible to make those changes. Even at a smaller level, we have services in Victoria that don't use seclusion. Peninsula Health down on the coast hasn't had a seclusion event in over a year. So for those people who say it can't be changed, it's not true. It can happen. It's, you know, available 60 kilometres down the road.
I'm very conscious that we get some messages out to the community. If you feel a loved one or yourself is being in breach of your care, who are the people that you can contact to?
As in, if someone is subject to compulsory treatment, or
and they feel as though they're being held against their will, and they know they're okay, or maybe, but for whatever reason, like and I can't remember the term, is it the advocate? Maybe you can explain that to our...
Yeah, great. So if you're someone with lived experience, or you know someone with lived experience who's been detained and wants to know their rights and doesn't want to be there, the Independent Mental Health Advocacy Service is a non-legal advocacy service for people subject to compulsory treatment here in Victoria. That's a free service. I can't remember their phone number.
We'll put a links to all those things for you.
Awesome. And Victoria Legal Aid as well. They provide legal advocacy. So I used to work at those organisations, and that would be your first port of call. There's other services available we can put in the show notes, but the first thing to know is you do have rights. The people who are treating you do have responsibilities. They might not always be upheld. So talk to a lawyer, make a complaint if you need to, but try to get the most information you can, because you're certainly not alone, and you're certainly not without rights.
Simon, I've just enjoyed this immensely. I have to say, in 2025, I have been waiting to have you on for so long, and this has been
very
wonderful.
lucky. Yeah.
Now, tell me, where is Simon up to now? What's the next? What's heading for Simon the next couple months?
I'm doing some advocacy around a freedom of information case, so I'll be sort of advocating for more transparency in the mental health system in the coming months. I do some consultancy work, so I do work with some mental health services. I supervise people with lived experience from my lived experience perspective, and just pick up work and try to make a difference where I can.
Schools, if you're wanting to get some perspectives on how we can work with positive behavioural support of young people, working with that label of disengaged young people, maybe have a chat to Simon and see some of his ideas that he can come across. Simon, it's been an absolute honour and privilege of having you. Thank you for coming on Quest by Community today.
It's mutual, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you everyone for listening today. I hope you have really enjoyed it as much as I have. And it's Ricki Spencer signing off for Quest by Community, Our Health Matters.